Welcome to Interface Studies. My name is Sadeh. Almost every screen we use today is a landscape rectangle, wider than it is tall. And on almost all of them, the content moves vertically, down, always down. So here's the question. If the screen is shaped one way, why does the content scroll the other way? And while we're at it, if a phone, held vertically, scrolled vertically feels natural, why doesn't a laptop screen scroll the long way too? This is in fact a wrong question. It is wrong because it assumes screen shape ought to determine scroll direction, and that assumption falls apart the moment you look at it. But it is the useful kind of wrong, because chasing it leads through 45 years of computing, through the web, through Microsoft's most ambitious operating system, Gamble, through a small Wayland compositor written in Rust, and through the resurgence of infinite canvases. And it ends with a clearer picture of what landscape screens are actually for. So for this video, we're not going to answer the question. We're going to walk through it, watch it fall apart, and notice what the failure tells us. Let's start from where most of us live, the browser. The web could scroll sideways. At the CSS level, the web treats horizontal and vertical overflow symmetrically, but the default block layout constrains width and allows height to grow, making horizontal overflow structurally exceptional. Frameworks like Bootstrap and Tailwind inherit this model. While they expose symmetric overflow utilities, their layout conventions assume horizontal containment. So sideways overflow is typically interpreted as a layout failure rather than an intentional behavior. Responsive design, Ethan Marcotte's term from May 2010, solved the multi-device problem by collapsing wide layouts into narrow ones. The collapse always happens vertically. Nobody, anywhere, designs for a viewport that scales by adding sideways scrolling as it gets smaller. The Nielsen-Norman Group has been calling horizontal scrolling a usability mistake since 2002, and it has not stopped. Their April 2014 article, Be Aware, Horizontal Scrolling and Mimicking Swipe on Desktop, phrased it bluntly. Users do not move sideways unless something forces them to. So the web is not vertical because the spec demands it. The web is vertical because the people who design websites, the people who write the frameworks, and the people who teach usability all agreed, implicitly and over 20 years, that sideways was a layout failure. That agreement, more than any technical constraint, is what locks the convention in. But there were some ambitious attempts. The most ambitious counter experiment to that convention is also the one that failed hardest. Windows 8, launched in October 2012, had a unique start screen. On it, and on most first party applications, the scrolling was horizontal. Tiles arranged in vertical groups. Those groups arranged left to right. The user moving sideways through the operating system. The design language was originally called Metro UI. Then Microsoft renamed it to Modern UI under some trademark concerns. The internal rationale was thoughtful, and it's worth getting right. Vertical scrolling, the design team argued, was for more of the same kind of thing. Horizontal scrolling was for moving to a different kind of thing. So an article scrolls vertically, more of the same article. But the start screen scrolls horizontally, because each panel was a different category of content. Microsoft built a feature called Semantic Zoom, which is a pinch to overview gesture that compressed the horizontal landscape into a labeled map. They knew that long horizontal space needed wayfinding. They thought they had the solution. Now, this experiment failed, not because the design was bad, but because the bet underneath it was wrong. Microsoft was wagering that touch was about to subsume desktop computing. Touch did become a common laptop feature from around 2014, and the Surface line from Microsoft succeeded as a category. But touch never displaced the keyboard and mouse desktop in the way Microsoft had wagered. Most laptops in 2012 had no touchscreen at all. The Metro start screen, navigated by a mouse wheel that the operating system had quietly remapped to scroll horizontally, felt wrong to the keyboard and mouse users. It was slow, disorienting, and hard to know where in the horizontal landscape you were. By the time Windows 10 arrived in July 2015, Microsoft had reverted. The Start menu came back. The horizontal start screen was abandoned, and the experiment was over. The lesson here is not that horizontal scrolling is impossible. The lesson is that horizontal scrolling on the desktop is a contract between content, hardware, and user expectation. You cannot rewrite one of those without rewriting the other two. Metro tried to change the content layout without controlling the hardware. Touch screens were not ubiquitous, and the user expectations were not met, especially when you control a horizontal scroll through a vertical wheel on a mouse. The contract broke. Now, this is not to say that horizontal scrolling does not work. There are systems where horizontal scrolling does work, and they share one feature. Let's consider this modern example, Niri. Niri is a Wayland compositor, and the central design move is that windows are arranged in columns on an infinite strip going to the right. I've spoken about that in a previous video about compositors and the desktop. When you open a new application, it appears as a new column. Move to it by sliding right. Move back by sliding left. There's no overlap, no minimize, no where did my window go. The horizontal axis is the spatial axis along which you live. Niri is heavily inspired by an older GNOME extension called PaperWM that goes back to 2017. Now, what makes Niri work, and what Metro lacked, is that it assumes a trackpad and keyboard user from the start. Three-finger swipe between columns. Key bindings to jump across the strip. The horizontal motion is cheap because the input device makes it cheap. A modern trackpad has no fixed axis. It can register sideways motion as easily as vertical motion. A keyboard shortcut pays the same cost in either direction. Under those input conditions, horizontal navigation costs nothing extra. The mouse wheel did not have that property. A mouse wheel is a single-axis device. Rotation maps to vertical scroll. Horizontal scroll requires a modifier key, or a tilting wheel, or a quiet remapping by the operating system, and all of which feel wrong because they break the wheel's natural one-to-one mapping. Metro asked a population of mouse wheel users to navigate horizontally, and the input device punished them for it. The same principle holds on macOS, slightly differently. We see it in Spaces, introduced in 2007 with macOS Leopard, and it folded into Mission Control in July 2011. It lays out virtual desktop in a horizontal row. You move between these virtual desktops by swiping 3 or 4 fingers sideways on the trackpad. Nobody complains because the trackpad makes the gesture trivial. The principle here is general. Horizontal axis as spatial navigation works when the hardware supports it. Niri and macOS Spaces all use the horizontal axis to move between things, between windows, between desktops, but never within a single thing. They navigate, but they do not scroll. Let's return for the web for a moment. Horizontal scrolling does survive in one form there. When a website scrolls sideways, it almost always does so for emphasis, which means editorial reasons. Horizontal scrolling is treated as the marked case, used sparingly. It is the italics of the medium, if you will. It says, pause here. Look at this. The page is doing something deliberate. Focus on it, and then we'll go back to normal. It does not say this is how you read for the next 10 minutes. The moment the horizontal stretch ends, the page returns to vertical and the reader to their habit. If you're old enough to remember MySpace, around 2012 they came up with a completely new redesign, which was purely based on horizontal scrolling. The argument was to use it for visuals, music, images, and all of that. The pattern, horizontal as emphasis, not default, is the only one the web has settled on. Full page horizontal sites remain rare. There are, of course, places on the desktop where horizontal scrolling has worked without any problems, and looking at them gives the rule. Looking at spreadsheets, for example, all spreadsheets apps, none of them treated horizontal scrolling as a problem to be solved, because in a spreadsheet, the rows and the columns encode different variables. A row is a record, a column is a field. The two axes mean different things. The same logic underpins every other professional tool where horizontal scrolling is uncontroversial. Video editors put the timeline horizontally because time flows left to right. Avid Media Composer did this in 1989, and Premiere, Final Cut, Pro Tools, and Ableton all inherited the convention. Gantt charts have been horizontal since they were invented. Kanban boards follow the same rule. Horizontal scrolling works when the axis carries a meaning the user actively cares about. Things like time, workflow stage, hierarchy depth, tabular column. The axis is loaded with semantic content, and the user moves along it because they are tracking that content. Horizontal scrolling fails on the web, in Metro, in a long article, when the axis is asked to encode more of the same thing the vertical axis is already encoding. That is the category error. Two axes doing the same job is not richer. It is duplicated. The user's reading direction breaks. The wheel breaks. The framework defaults break. Metro's mistake was exactly this. Each start screen group was supposed to be different in kind. Now that leaves us with the original puzzle. The screen has been landscape for 40 years. Why has the content stayed portrait? The answer is simply the document model. The Xerox Alto in 1973 did have a portrait CRT designed to mimic a sheet of paper. That part is true. The Alto was a research machine. About 2,000 of them were made, none sold. And its portrait orientation died with its commercial successor, the Xerox Star, which also sold poorly. The Apple Lisa in 1983 and the original Macintosh a year later both shipped with landscape screens. And both of them did not have the standard landscape aspect ratio we know today. It wasn't even the standard back then. What propagated forward was not the Alto screen, but the document it had hosted. The early days of personal computing were all about documents. PARC built the first WYSIWYG editor, Bravo, and it was paired with the first laser printer. Together they defined the page-shaped editable document destined for paper. Charles Simonyi left PARC for Microsoft in 1981 and carried the model into Microsoft Word, which shipped in 1983. Tim Berners-Lee inherited it again with HTML in 1989, a vertically flowing page of text, structured by headings and paragraphs. CSS in 1994 made block element stack top to bottom by default. We have spent 40 years of scrolling vertically because we are still reading something shaped like a sheet of A4, displayed on a piece of glass shaped like a television. But the widescreen did not stay empty. Where horizontal scrolling could not break the page, computing built a different grammar around it. We have the canvases, for example. The idea is older than its current products, with Pad++, which is the foundational zoomable user interface paper. Today we see it in Miro, Figma, FigJam, and most AI creative tools. All of these tools treat the screen as a window into a continuous plane that the user pans across and zooms into. The dominant gesture is two-finger drag and pinch on a trackpad, or wheel with modifier on a mouse. The same gesture Microsoft once mapped onto semantic zoom, now reborn for a different purpose. The wrong question we started with assumed the widescreen wanted to be a sideways feed. It does not. The page is still portrait. The screen is still landscape. And the piece of glass on our desk is more often than not a window onto a 2D plane that we are slowly learning to walk through.